So I'm back after a bit of a hiatus to talk about the new 30th anniversary box set edition of the Yes album Talk, which originally, of course, came out in 1994. I want to talk a bit about the material that's included in that reissue, about what you get with your purchase, and whether or not I'd recommend that you buy a copy. Before I do that, though, I want to give some thoughts about the underlying album and its place in Yes history. Before I get into any of that, I am Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We're a contemporary art rock project which fuses aspects of progressive rock, post-rock, and post-punk. In the description for this video, you can find a YouTube playlist of some of my favorite of our work. So Talk was, of course, the last album that Yes did with Trevor Rabin, and, it exists in a little bit of a limbo between the commercial heights of the 80s material and then the reunion of the classic lineup that occurred in the 90s. For a long time, I think it was something that was relatively overlooked in the catalog of the band. This was one of the earliest albums to be recorded onto digital using a computer rather than audio tape. And that was in a time when, doing that was a much bigger pain in the butt than just using the classic form of recording. And I think you can hear that in the result, right? The sound of it has a slickness and a cleanness that feels intensely digital, even though the music itself doesn't feel sequenced or programmed, right? It does feel very much like a live band, just one that is being run through a computer to capture its sound. And in a way, that is something that makes it a forerunner of where a lot of music would end up over the following 30 years. And you can debate whether or not digital recording and the widespread shift to digital has been a benefit, but I think that element of experimentation makes this arguably the last Yes album that really feels progressive in the lower piece sense of exploring new frontiers. But it helps that there's actually a lot of really great material here, right? There are lovely melodies, there are exciting solos, there are songs which might not be as complicated as the 70s material, but that do take their time to unfold in more complicated structures than just verse and chorus. There's even a multi-part 15-minute suite. So this album is more ambitious than 90125 and Big Generator. It's vastly more consistent than Union. That, obviously would make it far and away the best of the Rabin material. It seems to me to be self-evidently better than the follow-up album Open Your Eyes, which I've seen people defend in the comments of my videos for reasons that are inscrutable to me, at least. And this is probably more controversial, but I would probably at the very least tie it out with the latter. That album, The Ladder, it has some lovely material, and it probably is more consistent than Talk from a writing standpoint. But I think Talk has more range in terms of style and dynamics, and, that makes it at least intermittently more exciting. And the keys to Ascension albums, taken as a whole, obviously, are, better listening experiences, given that they're mostly live renditions of classic material played by a classic lineup, but the studio tracks from those albums have never really lived up to the weight of expectations of that personnel, right? They often feel oddly leaden and sluggish. So there you go. My own hot take would be that Talk is actually the best Yes album between Drama and Magnification, probably only bested after that by Fly From Here, which has the somewhat unfair advantage of its best portions having been written in the early 80s. Now, I'll admit that opinion is probably somewhat influenced by my own history with the album Talk. I remember being 10 years old, hearing the opening track and lead-off single The Calling on the radio, liking it enough to tape it, asking my parents to buy me the album. I actually heard this album before I heard any other Yes album. I was maybe 11 or 12. And, absent any real knowledge of what Yes meant, absent any sense of where this really kind of stood in the larger history of the band, I was just completely taken with it, right? It was one of those things that you hear as a young person where your mind is blown in a way that gets you excited in a new way about the possibilities of music, really. It's similar in a way to experiences that I had with We Can't Dance or The Division Bell, right? Two other distinctly imperfect but fundamentally worthy late career albums that I've stood up for elsewhere on this channel. And I should say that Talk is notably imperfect, right? You know, the first 3 songs have all the elements of sound and writing and performance very well in balance. They're catchy, they're progressive, they're beautiful, they're fairly heavy for what you'd expect from Yes in the 90s. There's a couple of middling songs after that that have some interesting ideas, but kind of feel musically and lyrically more lightweight compared to that opening trio, more in line with something from the Big Generator era. Where Will You Be, I think, is a pretty lovely bit of John Anderson new aginess, but, you know, the 15-minute suite that I mentioned earlier, Endless Dream, it's honestly a little bit of a mess, right? You know, there are lots of pieces of it that are very good in isolation, but, you know, the way that it's put together doesn't necessarily have the kind of sweep and arc and build that you'd hope for in a long song. It leads off with a really fast bit that's cool in a vacuum, but doesn't really tie to anything else in the song. There's a couple minutes of terrible synth noises that everybody hates, and then, you know, the other 8 or so minutes feel like the part that would be the uplifting climax at the end of a long song, but they fail to be uplifting because they're not really coming at the end of some other thing that builds up to them, if that makes sense. So this is a very uneven album that does soar remarkably high at the times that it soars. I'm fond enough of it that I may be overrating it, but, you know, anyone who's a fan of classic Yes or progressive music in general will probably enjoy the good parts pretty well, and, you know, it's an interesting exercise to pick out what makes the bad parts bad. Now, is this album actually underrated? I mean, I said in the title of the video that it was. I do wonder if it's maybe reached a point now where it's so often referred to as underrated that it's become properly rated. A similar thing has happened to Tornado, which is now so often referred to as underappreciated that I've personally come to regard it as, through that compensation, having maybe come all the way around to being somehow overrated, but, you know, that's a topic for another time. So, this box set came out on the label Spirit of Unicorn, which I didn't really have on my radar up until now, but they're doing some interesting box set reissues of things like John Wetton, other kind of, you know, post-prime prog rock, either, you know, post-prime periods in the careers of big bands or solo albums from luminaries. But in this case, you know, they really haven't come up with much bonus material to accompany that core album that is in any way interesting or surprising. And as much as I love this album, it's hard to defend the actual box set as a necessary purchase. The booklet does make pretty interesting reading material. You know, it goes through the history of the album in a way that's not completely revelatory if you know the band, but is interesting to read. But there's a line in here that I think kind of summarizes some of the, I don't know, sloppiness of the set pretty well. So the history of the album in the booklet ends with a quote from Trevor Rabin where he says, "It's such a good record, and I felt like it deserved so much more at the time." Now, that I can agree with. And then he follows it with, "Now, when this remix comes out, everyone's going to say, oh, what a brilliant record." But this doesn't include a remix. So whoever was interviewing Rabin maybe misdescribed the project to him, or there was a planned remix that fell through, or, you know, Rabin got confused about the difference between a remix and a remaster. I don't know. It's just a weird little error, right? And it calls a lot of attention to itself because it's the last thing in the booklet. So, you know, it sends the reader off with a confusing misconception and suggests that the band didn't really even know what was going to be included in the set as it was being compiled. So if there's not a remix, what do we have? Well, there's a remaster of the original album, which I don't know if I would have gone into this thinking that it needed a remaster, right? The original version, you know, you might criticize some of the cleanness or the slickness of the production, but it sounds bright, it sounds clear, it sounds rich, very listenable, whether you're hearing it on headphones or on a good home setup or, you know, on the CD player of your mom's Geostorm on a sunny day in 1995. But in case you're interested, here's a couple side-by-sides of the original release and the new remaster. So glancing at the file for The Calling, you can see it's a bit quieter, right? The remaster in this set is a bit quieter. The original is a fairly loud master, as you would have expected from early digital recording in 1994. If we listen to a clip of the one and then the other. So here's the original. Then the remaster. So I have to admit that actually sounds pretty good, right? It feels like there's a little bit more low end in the mix in a way that allows the bass to stand out a bit more. It's not a full remix, but you're kind of maybe a little bit more aware of the bass playing because of the way that the combination of overall a quieter master with a little bit more bass response, the way that that kind of makes a more of a contrast between those elements. It's not transformative, but it's good as an incremental improvement. Interestingly, if we look at the song I Am Waiting, you can see that in this case, the remaster is actually louder during the quiet bits, maybe even a smidge louder during the loud bits too. So kind of a different approach than the last song, which is interesting. Listening to it, you can hear a bit more fullness and thickness in the bass once again. Here's the original. Here's the remaster. So that's not a bad remaster. It is probably the version of this album that I'll listen to in the future. On the other hand, it's a little hard for me to argue that it single-handedly justifies the cost of the box, and it doesn't transform the experience of hearing the album. The second disc is some studio curios. You have 3 different edits of The Calling. 2 of those are just compressed versions for radio, which who the hell needs those? There's instrumental versions of a couple songs, none of which were ever cluttered enough with vocals that it feels revelatory to have an instrumental. But there are a couple of interesting things. There's a version of The Calling that is called here the special version. It drops abruptly into dark ambient music halfway through. This was included on CD singles from the time as the original version, but I'd never heard it before. I do think that's an intriguing effect, a cool take on the song. I can probably see why they left it off the album because, the full, or the album version rather, has so much momentum and it does so much to kind of lead it off in this energetic way, and, having that dropout in the middle would do a different thing with the dynamic arc of the whole album. But it is a pretty cool piece. It's a pretty cool variation. You could get I looked on Discogs and you can get a copy of the CD single that has this for like $8. So, maybe still not worth the price of the box set, but not something I would have ever thought to track down or listen to if not for having purchased it. There's also something that's described as a demo of Endless Dream that's more accurately, I'd say, a work-in-progress jam. Does give a little bit of an insight into the lighthearted mood that seems to have been present in the studio. Kind of fun, but again, ultimately something of passing interest that makes it hard to justify the price of the set, even for long-term fans. Lastly, we have discs 3 and 4, which are a live show from Canandaigua, New York. The sound quality here is fine. It's clearly not an official live album, but it's listenable. The playing is energetic, even if a few details have a little bit of, mess in them. And there's some interesting quirks of this tour, most notably Trevor Rabin opening And You and I with a piano solo to replace Steve Howe's acoustic solo. But this show's been circulating on bootleg for years. It's available for free online with pretty minimal searching. So again, it's kind of hard to justify the expense to have a hard copy of it in this set. It's cool that there's a record of what this lineup and this material sounded like live, but I don't know how much anybody's going to come back to this on a super regular basis. Also, for some reason, the song The Calling, I keep mentioning that song, but for some reason that song has been cut here to the latter 3 minutes, even though the bootlegs contain the full version. So given that the distinguishing factor here is the material from Talk, and this is one of the best songs from Talk, it's kind of weird that that would be cut in half. So overall, Talk, Great album. I can see why they felt like it deserved an anniversary box set. But you know, it kind of feels like they came up with the idea of doing an anniversary box for this album and then weren't able to come up with any really compelling material to actually carry out that idea. I'm probably about as big a fan of this album as exists, and I can't say I got any particular insight into it from this box set or, you know, added much to my collection that was really compelling material. It's not like there's nothing here. The remaster is, you know, a nice improvement. There's a couple interesting curios on the second disc, and you know, if you're a real hardcore Yes collector, I guess having a hard copy of discs of the live show on discs 3 and 4 is something, you know. But it's, I mean, with shipping, I paid about $80 for this, and I don't know if I would recommend that anybody else do the same. I hope the release of this box brings some new listeners to this album, but you know, if you've never heard it before, you're probably better off buying a used copy on eBay for $10. Thanks for everybody's time. Remember to check out the playlist of my material in the link in the description of this video. If you haven't been too put off by the negativity that I'm showing in this particular review. And yeah, see everybody in maybe a week. I don't know. I've been kind of busy lately, so my upload schedule has been paused for a bit. I'm going to try to get back into regular uploading, but it might be kind of patchy for a while. I'm sure nobody cares too much. Hope you have a good day.